Hello again, 102. In this video, I will go over the beginning of chapter 20, some of the sources of thought and some of the motives of the Progressive Era reformers, some of the sources of activism, and there will be 6 different parts in this chapter. And at the time, our country was going through a terrific period of unrest. Explained Amos Pinchot, who was a leading progressive attorney, something was wrong. Corruption was destroying our respect for government, uprooting faith in political parties, and causing every precedent and convention of the old order to strain in its moorings. Pinchot and other progressives argued that the United States had been changing so rapidly since the end of the Civil War that the nation was at risk of imploding from within. The country was the fastest growing industrial economy in the world by 1900, but prosperity was not being evenly shared. There was a huge gap between rich and poor during the Gilded Age, as we have seen in previous videos, and now something, it's believed, by the turn of the century needs to be done about it. Between 1890 and 1920, progressive reformers attacked the pressing problems created by unregulated industrialization, unplanned urbanization, and the increasingly unequal distribution of wealth and power. But most of all, they insisted, something must be done to control the very large, powerful corporations that dominated economic activity and had corrupted its political life. So those are the 4 big issues of the progressive era. However, progressives are liberals, not revolutionaries, as many people in Europe had become. They wanted to reform and regulate capitalism, not destroy it. Most progressives were very, very civic-minded. Unlike populism, whose appeal was largely in small areas of the rural South and in the farm areas of the Midwest, progressivism was a wide-ranging national movement, centered in large cities, but also popular in rural areas, among what came to be called populist progressives. And progressivism was more widespread impulse than just the 2 major parties. People came from all different walks of life. Roosevelt called progressivism the forward movement because it's seeking to improve the quality of the entire nation's life. And here are some of the different individuals and groups that made up the progressive movement. All kinds of different activists from these different individuals and groups. Atheists and agnostics, if you can believe that. The goal was to make government more efficient, businesses more honest, and safer for workers and consumers. And how are they going to go about doing this? There are now new fields of study like sociology, political science, psychology, public health, economics that are being developed at new research universities like Johns Hopkins in Maryland. The progressive approach to social problems was to investigate, educate, and legislate. If we can look at this scientifically, ladies and gentlemen, and develop solutions to these problems, they can then be disseminated amongst the public. So, if democracies are having problems, the problems of democracy then, it was thought, could be solved by more democracy. It has its flaws then, and limitations, and inconsistencies, because many times some of the motives are very moralistic, but their do-good perspective is limited by the Zeitgeist, or the spirit of those times. They have all of the racial and ethnic prejudices of the very, very early 20th century, and the resulting social and economic snobbery that goes along with that. More than any other factor, the devastating depression of the 1890s ignited the progressive spirit of reform. It was the worst downturn in American history. Nearly a quarter of the workforce was out of work. Unbelievably, An estimated 10 million of 82 million Americans lived in poverty, 1 out of 8, with annual incomes barely adequate to provide the minimum necessities of life at the turn of the century. And as we've said, populism was another thread then that developed in the 1890s that became later the progressive movement. Although Bryan had lost in 1896, as we saw in an earlier video, and the Populist Party was pretty much ended at that time, many of their reforms then will be adopted mainly by the Democratic Party, and they will be pushed by the progressive movement in the early 20th century. And as we'll see by the end of this series of videos, things like direct election of senators, the income tax, and the regulation of corporations and monopolies will be accomplished during this era. Other sources were the mugwumps of the late 19th century who were interested in supporting an honest government, which led to the Pendleton Act, as we saw, where civil service will replace patronage as the source of government jobs. This was a big early beginning of progressive thinking. Socialist ideas will also be very, very important in ensuring a minimum standard of living. Trying to deal with people in old age will begun to be discussed during the progressive era. They won't be able to do anything about that until the 1930s and the New Deal, but it's beginning to be a force. Socialists also believe in taxation as a way of redistributing some of the wealth that can be then used to support government programs to try and solve social problems. Again, and these are not radicals. American socialists want to reform. They do not want to overthrow as Europeans do. They focus on improving working conditions, closing the widening income gap between rich and poor, again through taxation, as I mentioned. They are reformers and not radicals. They reject both the extremes of socialism, violent overthrow of the bourgeoisie on the Marxist model, or laissez-faire individualism, where there should be no government interference in the lives of individuals. They prefer a regulated capitalism softened by humanitarianism, or what will be called later in the 20th century, human rights. Muckrakers were another source of the progressive movement. They exposed corruption and abuses in politics, business, consumer safety, working conditions, and more, spurring interest then in progressive reforms. Some of these muckrakers were Jacob Riis, How the Other Half Lives, a very famous photojournal essay that exposed living conditions in New York City tenements, where unbelievable amounts of people will be living in confined spaces designed for maybe 1 or 2 people. Ida Tarbell, more on her in a moment, Ray Stanford Baker, Steffens, William Allen Wright, and Roosevelt was the man who gave the muckrakers their nickname. They're indispensable to the society, but only when they know to stop raking the muck. McClure's magazine was a progressive publication of the time, and Tarbell wrote her expose of the Standard Oil Company of John D. Rockefeller, which will culminate in an antitrust suit against Standard Oil in 1911, and it ends up breaking it up. Muckraking is different from the yellow journalism of the 1890s because they are exposing problems. They are not creating stories with their imagination as the yellow journalists did with Remember the Maine and trying to develop something. They are actually studying problems that exist and then bringing them to the public's attention, and then hopefully then those problems can be addressed and be solved. The social gospel is another source of progressive thought to how we can solve these problems caused by urbanization and industrialization. It's an obligation. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, Washington Gladden, a Massachusetts clergyman, said. It's a duty and an obligation in order to help those that are in need. And these are institutions that were developed to try to address and implement the social gospel, the Young Men's Christian Association, the Young Women's Christian Associations, and the borrowed idea in England of the Salvation Army to tackle the problems of alcoholism. Walter Rauschenbusch was another champion of the social gospel in his book published in 1907, Christianity in the Social Crisis. Whoever uncouples the religious and social life has not really understood Jesus. Personal salvation must be linked to an equally passionate commitment to social justice. Churches must embrace the social aims of Jesus, for Christianity was intended to be a revolutionary faith. Not an overthrow of governments, but a revolution in the spirit will solve the social problems of the time. Interesting idea. The Settlement House, or the Social Work House of Jane Addams and Hull House in Chicago, was another source of the progressive movement, dealing with the problems of women and children. Ladies can go to these places to get help with the problems that they're facing in urban life. And she will later advocate more political reform as well. Getting the vote. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton founded the National Women's Suffrage Association to promote women's suffrage amendment to the Constitution. They condemned both the 14th and 15th Amendments for limiting citizenship and voting rights to males only. And that will be the last big thing done in the progressive era right after the First World War. They will finally implement nationwide something that the western states had taken the lead in. Wyoming has women's voting rights in 1869, but it won't be until 1919 that it is finally adopted with the 19th Amendment nationwide. And the western states tended to be more democratic because when men and women working in these areas worked side by side, and they were more quick to embrace equality, whereas in the Northeast and on the East Coast, women are still pretty much domestic servants well into the 20th century. And that ends this first part on the sources and motives of the progressive movement.